In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. These words have echoed through time, offering comfort and inspiration to countless souls. But have you ever truly immersed yourself in the rich tapestry of stories that follow? Welcome to this video, where we'll take you on a peaceful voyage through the book of Exodus, a story of miracles, deliverance, and unwavering faith. Each moment unfolds like a gentle wave, guiding you into a state of deep relaxation and reflection. You'll hear of Moses calling from the burning bush, the plagues that shook Egypt, the miraculous parting of the Red Sea, and God's provision in the wilderness. Timeless accounts that reveal the power of faith and divine intervention. Let these sacred narratives become your pathway to tranquil sleep and spiritual renewal. Before we begin, I'd love for you to comment below and share where in the world you're listening from. And if you have any prayer requests, please feel free to leave them. I would be honored to pray for you. Now, if you're comfortable, let's begin our journey into the book of Exodus. Imagine a mother's desperate choice to place her baby in a basket on the dangerous waters of the Nile, hoping against hope for his survival. This was Jochebed's reality as she lived under the shadow of Pharaoh's cruel decree. The Egyptian ruler, fearful of the growing Hebrew population, had commanded that every newborn Hebrew boy be thrown into the Nile River. The Israelites had once been honored guests in Egypt, invited during Joseph's time when famine struck their homeland. But generations passed, and the Egyptians forgot Joseph's contributions. Instead, they saw only a foreign people multiplying rapidly within their borders. These Hebrews are becoming too numerous, the new Pharaoh declared. They might join our enemies if war breaks out. And so began generations of brutal slavery, forced labor making bricks under the hot Egyptian sun, building the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramesses. But even harsh slavery didn't slow the growth of the Hebrew people. In desperate cruelty, Pharaoh escalated his tactics, ordering the Hebrew midwives Shiphrah and Puah to kill all baby boys at birth. When these courageous women feared God more than Pharaoh and let the babies live, he issued his most terrible command yet. Every Hebrew boy must be thrown into the Nile. In those dark days, a son was born to Amram and Jochebed of the tribe of Levi. The mother looked upon her newborn with both joy and terror. Scripture tells us she saw that he was a fine child, perhaps sensing something special about this baby that gave her the courage to defy Pharaoh's decree. For 3 precious months, she managed to hide him, muffling his cries, keeping him concealed from Egyptian inspectors who prowled through Hebrew homes. But a baby growing stronger each day could not remain hidden forever. With time running out, Jochebed conceived a desperate plan. If Pharaoh demanded her son be placed in the Nile, she would obey, but on her own terms. With trembling hands, she wove a basket of bulrushes, carefully coating it with tar and pitch to make it waterproof. Can you imagine her whispered prayers as she lined it with soft cloth, creating a floating cradle for her precious child? The morning came when she could wait no longer. Holding her baby close one last time, breathing in his scent, memorizing his face, she placed him gently in the basket. The Nile's waters could mean death, but they might also carry him to safety. His sister Miriam, just a young girl herself, followed at a distance as Jochebed set the basket among the reeds near where Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe. Providence guided that small ark to the exact spot where the Egyptian princess came to the river. Seeing the basket, she sent her servant to fetch it. When she opened it and the baby cried, compassion flooded her heart. "This is one of the Hebrew children," she said, recognizing the truth but choosing mercy over her father's command. Seizing this moment of divine opportunity, Miriam approached with remarkable courage. "Shall I go and call a Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you?" she asked. With the princess's approval, Miriam ran to bring the baby's own mother. Imagine the scene as Jochebed stood before royalty, trying to mask her joy as Pharaoh's daughter said, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." And so Moses grew in a remarkable arrangement, nurtured in his earliest years by his Hebrew mother who could teach him about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, yet officially the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. In the royal court, he received the finest Egyptian education, learning writing, mathematics, architecture, and leadership. This unique upbringing in two worlds would uniquely position him for the role God had designed long before his birth. The palace halls echoed with privilege but rang hollow in Moses' heart. Those two worlds of Egyptian royalty and Hebrew heritage couldn't remain separate forever within him. While Egyptian tutors had taught him to lead among the elite, God was preparing him for a different kind of leadership altogether, one that would begin not with acclaim, but with a single impulsive act that would cost him everything he knew. As a young man, Moses moved through Pharaoh's court with the confidence of someone raised in luxury. Court officials bowed slightly as he passed, servants hurried to fulfill his requests, and the finest Egyptian scholars continued to mentor him in the wisdom of the empire. Yet beneath his royal garments beat a heart increasingly troubled by what he witnessed beyond the palace walls. Perhaps it began with small observations, the way Egyptian overseers spoke harshly to Hebrew workers, or how his own people grew increasingly gaunt while the royal storehouses remained full. Scripture tells us that when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. No longer sheltered by palace walls, he witnessed firsthand the brutal treatment his people endured. One day, the abstract became unbearably personal. Walking among the construction sites where Hebrews labored under the desert sun, Moses saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave mercilessly. The man's cries pierced through any remaining illusion that Moses could forever live between two worlds. Blood from his own blood was being spilled before his eyes. Scripture describes the pivotal moment. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. In that single act of violent justice, Moses made his choice. No longer would he be Pharaoh's adopted grandson first and a Hebrew second. His true identity emerged in righteous anger. But justice delivered in secret seldom remains hidden. The very next day, Moses attempted to resolve a conflict between two Hebrews fighting with each other. "Why do you strike your companion?" he asked the aggressor. The man's response shattered Moses' world. "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" What Moses thought had been a private act of justice had become dangerous public knowledge. Word reached Pharaoh himself, who now sought to kill Moses. The man who once had access to every luxury in Egypt suddenly became its most wanted fugitive. With the palace guards searching for him, Moses fled across the harsh desert landscape toward Midian. Every privilege he had known, every comfort of royal life, every plan for his future, all abandoned in his desperate flight. The prince became a refugee, carrying nothing but his conscience and the growing awareness of God's hand upon his life. In Midian, Moses' education continued in a way no royal tutor could have provided. Sitting beside a well, he intervened when shepherds harassed the 7 daughters of the priest of Midian as they attempted to water their flocks. This act of justice, unlike his killing of the Egyptian, brought blessing rather than danger. Jethro, the priest, welcomed Moses into his home and eventually gave him his daughter Zipporah in marriage. The man who once commanded attention in royal halls now led sheep through quiet pastures. The one educated in architecture now built simple shelters. The prince became a shepherd, learning patience and attentiveness to the needs of creatures dependent on him, qualities that would serve him well when he would later shepherd God's people through the wilderness. For 40 years, Moses walked the same dusty paths with his sheep, until one ordinary morning when everything changed forever. God often speaks most clearly in the moments we least expect. While Moses had grown comfortable in his simple shepherd's life, heaven was about to interrupt his routine with a flame that would burn but not consume. The wilderness had become Moses' classroom, teaching him lessons of patience no palace could provide. Day after day, year after year, he guided his father-in-law's flocks through the barren landscapes of Midian, finding patches of grass and water in seemingly impossible places. On this particular day, he led them beyond their usual grazing grounds, venturing to the far side of the wilderness near a mountain called Horeb. The air shimmered with desert heat as Moses climbed the rocky slopes. Perhaps he was searching for new pasture, or maybe he simply sought the solitude of higher ground. Then something caught his eye, a flickering light in the distance. A bush was on fire, yet as he watched, puzzled, he realized the flames weren't consuming the branches. Minutes passed, and still the bush remained intact. "I must turn aside and see this strange sight," Moses murmured to himself, curiosity drawing him closer. The hot sand crunched beneath his sandals as he approached. The fire cast dancing shadows across the rocky ground. But there was something different about this light, brighter, more intense than ordinary flame. Then came the voice, clear and unmistakable, calling his name from within the fire itself. "Moses, Moses." The desert stillness shattered as the voice of God broke into human history. "Here I am," Moses responded, his heart pounding. "Do not come any closer," the voice commanded. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses quickly removed his worn sandals, his hands trembling. As the magnitude of the moment washed over him, he hid his face, afraid to look upon God. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob," the voice continued. The words settled deep into Moses' soul. This was the God of his ancestors, the God of the promises, speaking directly to him. "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering." As Moses listened, trembling, God revealed his divine plan. "I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Then came the words that would forever change Moses' life. "So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses' first response revealed his deep insecurity. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" The shepherd couldn't imagine confronting the most powerful ruler on earth. God's answer was simple yet profound. "I will be with you." When Moses continued to doubt, God provided 3 miraculous signs to convince both Moses and the elders of Israel. First, Moses' shepherd's staff transformed into a serpent when thrown to the ground, and became a staff again when he grasped it. Next, his hand became leprous when placed inside his cloak, then restored when he repeated the action. Finally, God promised that water from the Nile would turn to blood when poured on dry ground. Still Moses hesitated, pleading, "Lord, I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue." Even after God's patient reassurance, Moses begged, "Please send someone else." The Lord's anger burned against Moses, yet in mercy, he provided Aaron as a spokesman while insisting that Moses himself must go. With reluctant steps, Moses placed his family on a donkey and took his shepherd's staff, now transformed into an instrument of divine power, as he began the long journey back to Egypt. Can you imagine the weight of emotion as he approached the land where he was once a wanted fugitive? The same palaces that had sheltered him would soon tremble at his words, though Moses couldn't yet comprehend how completely God would shake the foundations of the most powerful empire on earth. Along the desert road, an unexpected reunion awaited. Aaron, Moses' brother whom he barely knew after 40 years of separation, came to meet him at the mountain of God. The brothers embraced, and Moses shared everything the Lord had commanded. Together they would stand before Pharaoh, Moses carrying divine authority and Aaron giving it voice. Upon reaching Egypt, they gathered the elders of Israel. Aaron spoke the words God had given Moses while Moses performed the signs, the staff becoming a serpent, his hand turning leprous then clean again, and water transforming to blood. The elders bowed their heads in worship when they saw these wonders, hope rising in hearts long crushed by generations of slavery. But hope would soon be tested. When Moses and Aaron approached Pharaoh's gleaming palace, a place where Moses had once walked freely as a prince, they stood as humble petitioners. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel," they declared, "let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's response was swift and dismissive. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." Not only did Pharaoh refuse their request, but he intensified the Israelites' labor. "You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks," he commanded his taskmasters. "Let them go and gather straw for themselves." The brick quotas remained unchanged, an impossible burden designed to crush their newfound hope. The Hebrew foreman, beaten for falling short of production, confronted Moses and Aaron with bitter accusations. "You have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." The very people Moses had come to deliver now blamed him for their increased suffering. Crushed by this turn of events, Moses returned to the Lord with raw honesty. "O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all." His complaint revealed the depth of his disappointment. Things were worse, not better, since his arrival. The Lord's response came not with rebuke, but with reassurance, revealing himself more fully. "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them." God reminded Moses of his covenant, promising again to deliver Israel with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. As the sun rose over Egypt the next morning, no one suspected that the greatest theological showdown in history was about to begin. This wasn't merely a conflict between a reluctant shepherd and a stubborn king. This was a divine contest that would systematically dismantle the very foundations of Egyptian religion. Each plague would target a specific Egyptian deity, revealing their powerlessness before the God of Israel. The first confrontation began at the lifeblood of Egyptian civilization. Standing at the bank of the Nile, Moses stretched out his staff over the waters that Egyptians worshipped through their god Hapi. Immediately, the river turned crimson, thick with blood, and the fish died, filling the air with a sickening stench. The sacred river that sustained all Egyptian life had become a source of death, leaving the Egyptian priests powerless to reverse what Moses had done. Soon after, frogs, sacred to the fertility goddess Hecate, swarmed from the contaminated waters. They invaded homes, bedrooms, and even kneading bowls. The creatures the Egyptians revered became an unbearable nuisance. In his misery, Pharaoh called for Moses and begged, "Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go." Yet when relief came, Pharaoh's heart hardened once again. The plagues intensified. Gnats rose from the dust of the earth, defiling the purity valued by Egyptian priests. Swarms of flies descended next, perhaps mocking Khepri, the fly-headed deity. When livestock fell diseased in the fields, the sacred bull of Apis offered no protection. Festering boils then broke out on Egyptian skin, leaving the healing goddess Isis powerless to cure them. With each plague, a pattern emerged. Pharaoh would summon Moses during his suffering, promising freedom for the Israelites. Yet when Moses prayed and God removed the plague, Pharaoh would promptly change his mind. His heart grew increasingly hard, like stone against water. The seventh plague brought thunderous hail mixed with fire that flashed to the ground, destroying crops and anyone caught in the open fields. This direct challenge to Nut, goddess of the sky, left the heavens themselves seeming to attack Egypt. Next came locusts so numerous they darkened the land, devouring whatever crops had survived the hail. The god Seth, protector of crops, stood silent as Egypt's food supply vanished. Most telling was the ninth plague, a darkness so thick it could be felt, lasting 3 days. While Ra, the sun god and chief deity of Egypt, seemed utterly defeated, the Israelites enjoyed light in their dwellings in Goshen. This visible distinction between the Egyptians and Israelites revealed God's protection over his people amid the devastation. With each confrontation, Moses stood more confidently before Pharaoh. The frightened shepherd was transforming into a bold ambassador of the living God. After the plague of darkness, Pharaoh exploded in anger. "Get away from me! Take care never to see my face again. For on the day you see my face, you shall die." Moses calmly replied, "As you say, I will never see your face again." Yet one final, devastating plague remained, one that would strike at the very heart of Egyptian society and religion. God had demonstrated his sovereignty over water, earth, animals, human health, weather, agriculture, and even the sun itself. Now he would prove his power over life and death in a way that would finally break Pharaoh's resistance. The final confrontation between God and Pharaoh wouldn't happen in the royal palace or before Egyptian officials. It would unfold in every home across the land. Picture yourself that night, eating bread without yeast, sandals on your feet, staff in hand, while outside the angel of death moves silently through the streets of Egypt, passing over only those dwellings marked with sacrificial blood. God spoke to Moses with precise instructions for Israel's deliverance. On the 10th day of this month, each household must select a perfect lamb, a year-old male without blemish, he commanded. The animal was to be kept for 4 days, allowing families to examine it carefully, ensuring its perfection. Then, as twilight fell on the 14th day, each family would slaughter their lamb, catching its precious blood in a basin. "Take a bunch of hyssop," God instructed. "Dip it in the blood, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts of your homes." This act of faith, painting blood on their doorframes, would create an invisible barrier that death could not cross. Inside those blood-marked homes, families were to roast the lamb with fire, eating it with bitter herbs and unleavened bread, symbolic reminders of their bitter slavery and the haste of their coming departure. The instructions continued with unusual urgency. "Eat with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste." This wasn't to be a leisurely meal but a readiness posture, like travelers prepared for immediate departure. As midnight approached, Hebrew families huddled behind those blood-marked doors. Children whispered questions about the strange ritual. Parents calmed their fears while their own hearts raced with anticipation. Outside, the normal sounds of Egyptian nightlife gradually fell silent, replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed to hold its breath. Then, at midnight, it happened. The destroyer moved through Egypt like a shadow, entering every home not protected by lamb's blood. From Pharaoh's palace to the darkest prison cell, death claimed the firstborn of every household, people and livestock alike. The scripture tells us, "There was not a house without someone dead." What began as hushed stillness erupted into a night-splitting wail that echoed across the land, a sound of mourning unlike anything ever heard before. Yet in the Hebrew homes, protected by that simple substance, the blood of a lamb, families remained safe, though surely trembling at the sounds of grief surrounding them. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Death and wailing outside, life and whispered prayers of gratitude within. Pharaoh, who had hardened his heart through 9 devastating plagues, finally broke. In the darkest hour of night, he summoned Moses and Aaron. "Up, leave my people," he demanded, his voice likely strained with grief over his own son's death. "Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds and go. And also bless me." The Egyptians, no longer concerned with keeping their slave workforce, now urgently pressed the Israelites to leave. "Go quickly," they pleaded, "or we will all die." They even gave the Israelites articles of silver and gold, fine clothing, anything to hasten their departure. What God had promised Moses at the burning bush had come to pass. The Israelites would not leave empty-handed. So began the Exodus, approximately 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, along with a mixed multitude of non-Israelites who chose to join them. After 430 years in Egypt, to the very day, The people marched out, organized by their tribes, carrying their unleavened dough on their shoulders. The celebration of newfound freedom would be short-lived as God deliberately positioned his people between the impossible and the unthinkable. There, at the shores of the Red Sea, with Egyptian chariots closing in behind them, the Israelites would discover that God's greatest miracles often appear only when we've exhausted every human possibility. After leaving Egypt, the Lord did not lead the Israelites along the shortest route to Canaan through Philistine territory. Though that path would have been more direct, God knew his newly liberated people weren't ready for war. Instead, he guided them toward the Red Sea, instructing Moses to have the people camp at Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, directly opposite Baal-Zephon. By day, a pillar of cloud led their way, mysterious and majestic against the desert sky. By night, this same pillar transformed into fire, providing both light and warmth in the wilderness darkness. The visible presence of God moved before them, setting their pace and direction with divine precision. Meanwhile, in Egypt's royal palace, Pharaoh's grief over his firstborn son had turned to rage and regret. "What have we done?" he demanded of his officials. "We have let Israel go and lost our servants." Within hours, he had readied his personal chariot and summoned his army, 600 of his best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, each with an officer commanding it. The thundering hooves of Egypt's military might kicked up clouds of dust as they pursued the defenseless former slaves. As the Israelites looked up and saw the approaching Egyptian army, terror seized their hearts. The sea stretched before them like an impenetrable barrier, while behind them, death approached in a cloud of dust. They were completely trapped. "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the wilderness?" They cried out to Moses, their voices sharp with fear and accusation. "What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." But Moses stood calm amidst their panic. "Do not be afraid," he answered. "Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." As the Egyptian army drew closer, something extraordinary happened. The pillar of cloud that had been leading the Israelites moved behind them, positioning itself between the Israelites and their pursuers. On the Egyptian side, the cloud brought darkness, while on the Israelite side, it gave light throughout the night. The armies couldn't come near each other all night long. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea." Moses obeyed, extending his staff over the vast waters. All through the night, the Lord drove the sea back with a powerful east wind, transforming the seabed into dry ground and dividing the water into walls on either side. Can you imagine walking that path? The Israelites stepped between towering walls of water, their feet on dry ground where fish had swum only moments before. The entire nation, men, women, children, elderly, and livestock, crossed through on dry land, with water standing like solid walls to their right and left. The Egyptians pursued them into the sea pathway, every horse, chariot, and soldier of Pharaoh's army. But as they reached the middle of the crossing, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud, throwing the Egyptian forces into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to come off so that they moved forward with difficulty. "Let's get away from the Israelites," the Egyptians shouted. "The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." As dawn broke over the eastern shore, a sound not heard for 400 years echoed across the wilderness, the sound of a people truly free. Have you ever wondered what the first words would be from an entire nation who just witnessed the impossible made possible before their eyes? Standing on the far bank of the divided sea, Moses began to sing. His voice, once hesitant before Pharaoh, now rang clear with certainty as he lifted the first notes of what would become Israel's anthem of deliverance. "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. Can you imagine the moment when thousands of voices joined his? People who hours earlier had trembled in fear now stood tall, their expressions transformed by the first taste of genuine freedom. Children who had only known the crack of taskmasters' whips now watched their parents dance and sing without restraint. Then Miriam, the prophetess, Moses' sister who had once watched over his basket in the reeds, took a tambourine in her hand. With rhythmic beats that seemed to match the pounding of their newly liberated hearts, she led the women in circular dances of celebration. "Sing to the Lord," she called out, her elderly frame suddenly light as she twirled with surprising grace. "For he has triumphed gloriously." The tambourines they carried revealed something remarkable about their faith. Even in their hasty departure from Egypt, these women had thought to bring instruments of praise, as if anticipating a moment worth celebrating. Their foresight spoke volumes about a hope that had never fully died during their generations of bondage. For so many gathered on that shore, this was the first moment they could truly process what had happened. They had walked through walls of water. They had seen an army vanish beneath the waves. Tears of joy mingled with tears of disbelief as parents embraced children, friends clutched friends, and strangers became family in their shared experience of the miraculous. The Song of Moses wasn't merely an expression of momentary relief. It became the template for all future worship in Israel. Its verses would be taught to children yet unborn, a constant reminder that their identity as a people began not with ancestral achievements, but with divine rescue. In later generations, the Psalms would echo its themes, and prophets would recall its imagery when promising future deliverance. This spontaneous worship established something profound in Israel's spiritual DNA, the pattern of remembering. Before giving any laws or commandments in formalized ways, God invited his people into the spiritual discipline of memorizing and recounting his mighty deeds through song. Their first act as a free nation wasn't government formation or military organization, but unified praise. Above them, the pillar of cloud continued its silent vigil, a visible reminder that the same God who had guided them through the sea would lead them into an unknown wilderness. Its presence whispered a profound truth. Their journey had only just begun. The God who split the waters would be the same God who would meet their needs in a barren land. Their journey into the wilderness revealed something unexpected about miracles. They don't prevent the next challenge from coming. As the Israelites followed that cloud deeper into the desert of Shur, they would discover an unsettling truth. Sometimes the first taste of freedom is bitter. For 3 days, they traveled through the scorching wilderness without finding water. Imagine the growing desperation. Parents watching their children's cracked lips, the elderly stumbling from dehydration, livestock growing weaker by the hour. The jubilant songs of victory that had filled their hearts at the seashore gradually faded into a chorus of parched throats and anxious whispers. Then, on the horizon, they spotted it. Water. Can you picture the excitement rippling through the camp? The quickened pace as thousands rushed forward? But that hope crumbled into disappointment when the first brave souls bent to drink. The water was bitter, undrinkable. The Hebrew word mara means exactly that. What seemed like salvation had become another cruel test. "What shall we drink?" they demanded of Moses. The complaint spread quickly through the camp. How fascinating that the same people who had witnessed the sea part before their very eyes now doubted whether God could provide something as simple as drinkable water. Their thirst overshadowed their memory of God's power. Moses, feeling the weight of their desperation, did what would become his pattern in crisis. He turned to God. He cried out in prayer, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. Following divine instruction, Moses cast the wood into the bitter waters. Miraculously, the waters became sweet, drinkable, life-giving. The bitter had been transformed. But this was more than just a solution to thirst. At Mara, God established a decree and law for his people. If you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. This first test revealed a fundamental principle for their wilderness journey. Obedience would lead to provision, and God's nature as healer extended beyond physical waters to every aspect of their lives. The bitter waters becoming sweet served as a living parable, God could transform their most desperate situations. From Mara's scarcity, God led them to Elim's abundance. Picture the contrast. Leaving waters that had been barely drinkable to arrive at an oasis with 12 springs and 70 palm trees. The symbolism couldn't be clearer. 12 springs for the 12 tribes, shade and rest after difficult testing. At Elim, they could recover, refill their water skins, and prepare for what lay ahead. This pattern of test, complaint, divine intervention, and provision would repeat throughout their wilderness years. Each challenge revealed something about their hearts and even more about God's character. The bitter waters of Mara taught them that God not only delivers his people from bondage, but sustains them through every trial of freedom. As the waters of Mara faded into memory, the Israelites faced an even more primal need stirring within them. Have you ever been so hungry that the memory of past meals haunts you like a ghost? The Israelites were about to discover that sometimes the greatest tests of faith arrive not as dramatic obstacles but as the quiet, persistent gnawing of an empty stomach. The journey deeper into the wilderness brought a new crisis. Their carefully packed provisions from Egypt, the bread needed in haste and carried on shoulders, had begun to run out. The entire community found themselves in the desert of Sin, between Elim and Sinai, with dwindling food supplies and growing anxiety. What good was freedom if it meant starvation in an endless wasteland? Their hunger quickly turned to grumbling. The entire community rose up against Moses and Aaron with bitter accusations. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt, where we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. You have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Notice how quickly human memory becomes selective in suffering, recalling only the pots of meat, forgetting entirely the lash of the whip. God's response revealed both compassion and purpose. I will rain down bread from heaven for you. This provision, however, came with a test. Would they follow his instructions? Would they gather only what they needed for each day? God was teaching them not just to receive his gifts, but to trust his ongoing care. What happened next must have seemed like a dream to the hungry Israelites. In the evening, a blanket of quail descended on the camp. So many birds they covered the ground. Meat appeared where there had been no flocks or herds. Then morning brought an even stranger sight. As the dew evaporated, a thin, flaky substance appeared on the desert floor, delicate as frost, yet substantial enough to satisfy hunger. Imagine the wonder on their faces as they ventured out of their tents to discover this mysterious food. What is it? They asked each other. In Hebrew, manhu, which is where we get the name manna. No one had seen anything like it before. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. The bread of angels, appearing as if from nowhere. The instructions for gathering this heaven-sent bread were precise. Each person was to collect an omer, about 2 quarts, per person in their household, enough for the day, no more and no less. And on the 6th day they were to gather a double portion, for the 7th day was to be a Sabbath of rest when no manna would appear. Yet even with divine bread literally at their feet, some still struggled to trust. Some tried to hoard extra manna overnight, despite Moses' warning. By morning, their stored portions had bred worms and began to smell. Others went out on the 7th day expecting to find manna, but the ground was bare. These disobediences revealed hearts still learning to trust in God's daily provision rather than their own efforts at self-preservation. For 40 years, this miracle would repeat itself, 6 days of provision, 1 day of rest. A generation would be raised never knowing any other bread but this heavenly food. The God who parted seas was teaching them something profound through this daily miracle. True freedom isn't found in stockpiled resources, but in moment-by-moment dependence on divine provision. While God had solved their hunger through manna, the harsh desert had another test waiting, one that would push the Israelites to the very edge of rebellion. What happens when God leads you to a place with no visible source of what you need most? At Rephidim, the absence of water would reveal both the fragility of human faith and the power of God to bring life-giving abundance from the most unyielding places. The Israelites' throats grew parched as they set up camp at Rephidim. The water skins hung empty, limp against their sides. Children cried from thirst, their tongues swollen, lips cracking in the merciless heat. Livestock grew weak, unable to produce milk for the infants. The human body can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. And in the scorching desert, that timeline shrinks dramatically. What began as murmurs of concern quickly escalated into a mob confronting Moses. Their voices grew hoarse with anger as they demanded, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Their question revealed a shocking amnesia about God's recent miracles. The same hands that had gathered manna that very morning were now clenched in frustrated fists. For Moses, this moment was different from previous complaints. A desperate thirst awakens something primal in humans, a willingness to do anything for relief. The situation deteriorated until Moses cried out to God in genuine fear. "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." Picture the weight of that moment. The deliverer of Israel now fearing for his life from the very people he had led to freedom. God's response came without rebuke. Instead, he offered a solution that would demonstrate his power in an unforgettable way. "Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." Can you see it? Moses gathering the elders as witnesses, approaching the massive stone formation at Horeb. Solid, impenetrable, seemingly the least likely source of water imaginable. With every eye fixed upon him, Moses raised the same staff that had parted the sea and brought it down upon the rock. The crack echoed through the canyon walls. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a trickle appeared from the stone, growing into a stream, then a rushing torrent of crystal-clear water. From solid rock came living water, enough for millions of people and their livestock. The impossible became possible. The hardest substance in their environment became the source of their salvation. As the people rushed forward, cupping their hands to drink the cool miracle, Moses named this place with two significant names: Massa, meaning testing, and Meribah, meaning quarreling. These names would stand as permanent reminders that doubt and complaint had preceded the miracle, that the people had questioned God's goodness even after witnessing his power. Yet from this crucible of thirst and complaint came not just physical relief but spiritual preparation. The Israelites were learning, sometimes painfully, that God's provision often comes not despite obstacles but through them. The very rock that seemed to represent their dead end became the channel for God's abundance. The miracle of water flowing from rock had barely quenched their thirst when a new threat emerged from the wilderness, one that couldn't be solved by staff or stone. As the Israelites refreshed themselves at Rephidim, shadows appeared on the distant horizon. The Amalekites, desert nomads and descendants of Esau, were approaching with weapons drawn. This wasn't a test of faith like the bitter waters or the hunger pangs. This was a test of force, their first military challenge as a newly liberated people. Picture the scene. A community with no military training, families still arranging their tents, the elderly resting, children playing. Suddenly faced with the prospect of battle, the Amalekites were opportunistic raiders, striking not at the front of the Israelite camp where the strongest might defend, but at the rear where the vulnerable stragglers traveled. These were not the disciplined forces of Pharaoh, but something perhaps more dangerous, warriors born to the harsh desert, at home in this wilderness where the Israelites were merely visitors. Moses turned to a young man whose name appears here for the first time in Scripture: Joshua. "Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites," Moses instructed him. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." In this moment, we witness the first glimpse of Joshua's leadership, a mantle he would fully inherit years later. As dawn broke, Joshua led the hastily assembled fighting force into the valley. These men had been slaves just weeks before, carrying bricks instead of swords, yet now they marched to defend their freedom. Above them on the hillside stood an unusual sight. Moses, with the staff of God raised high above his head, flanked by his brother Aaron and a man named Hur. What unfolded next reveals one of the most profound spiritual mysteries in Israel's wilderness journey. When Moses held his hands aloft, the Israelite forces surged forward, gaining ground against their enemies. Yet when his arms grew tired and began to lower, the Amalekites would immediately advance, pushing back the Israelite forces. A supernatural connection existed between the raised hands of their intercessor and the success of their warriors. Moses' arms grew heavy as the hours passed. The staff that had commanded the sea to part now seemed to weigh as much as the waters themselves. Seeing his struggle, Aaron and Hur found a stone for Moses to sit upon. Then, one on each side, they lifted his weary arms, supporting them steadily until the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Can you picture these three elderly men on the hilltop? One seated on a stone, arms outstretched toward heaven, the other two supporting him hour after hour? Below them, dust clouds rose from the battlefield as the tide of war shifted irrevocably in Israel's favor. By sunset, Joshua and his men had overcome the Amalekite forces with the edge of the sword. After the battle, God commanded Moses to record this victory in a scroll as a memorial, declaring that he would utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Moses built an altar there and named it, "The Lord is my banner," acknowledging that the victory came not through military might, but through divine power. The raised staff had become a banner, a visible sign of God's presence with his people. This first battle teaches us something profound about spiritual leadership and prayer. The physical struggle in the valley depended on the spiritual struggle on the hilltop. The warriors needed not just weapons, but also an intercessor. And even the intercessor needed support. Moses could not maintain his vigil alone, but required Aaron and Hur to uphold his tired arms. With their first battle behind them, the Israelites continued their journey toward an encounter beyond anything they could imagine. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to stand in the actual presence of God? Not just sensing his power from afar, but being summoned to meet him face to face. The trembling mountain ahead would soon become the stage for the most awe-inspiring divine appointment in Israel's history. In the 3rd month after leaving Egypt, the Israelites entered the wilderness of Sinai. Their tents spread across the desert floor as they made camp at the foot of a rugged mountain. The journey from slavery to this sacred meeting place had transformed them. They were no longer just escapees. They were pilgrims approaching holy ground. God called Moses to climb the mountain, and there among the weathered peaks, he proposed something unprecedented, a covenant relationship. "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself," God reminded Moses. "Now, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my special treasure above all people." This wasn't just another set of instructions. It was a divine proposal, an invitation into intimate relationship with the Creator of the universe. In that moment, God was asking not just for obedience but for partnership, offering Israel a unique identity as his treasured possession. When Moses brought these words to the elders, something miraculous happened. Without hesitation, the entire assembly responded with a single voice, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." The people who had complained about bitter water and absence of food now stood unified in their commitment to this covenant relationship. But meeting with God required careful preparation. Moses delivered God's instructions. They were to consecrate themselves for 2 days, wash their garments, and abstain from physical intimacy. Boundaries were set around the mountain with a solemn warning that anyone who touched its edge would be put to death. Even the animals were to be kept at a distance. These weren't arbitrary rules. They were preparations for an encounter with perfect holiness. The washing of garments symbolized the cleansing of hearts. The boundaries around the mountain reminded them of the profound difference between Creator and creation. On the morning of the third day, the mountain awakened with terrifying majesty. Thunder rumbled across the sky as lightning flashed against dark clouds. A thick cloud enveloped the peak, and a sound like a trumpet grew increasingly loud. The very ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Smoke billowed upward as if the mountain itself had become a furnace. The people emerged from their tents, trembling. Even from a distance, God's presence was overwhelming. Here was power beyond comprehension, holiness beyond imagination. The same God who had parted the waters was now making himself known not just through what he could do, but through who he was. Moses led the awestruck people to the foot of the mountain. The trumpet sound grew louder and louder until Moses spoke, and God answered him with a voice. Then the Lord descended upon Mount Sinai in fire, calling Moses to the summit. As they watched their leader disappear into the cloud of God's presence, the Israelites understood something profound. The God who had seemed distant in Egypt, the God they knew primarily through plagues and parted waters, was now inviting them into relationship. He was not just a deliverer passing through their lives, but a covenant partner who would journey with them. The cloud of God's presence enveloped the mountain as Moses vanished into its depths. What would it feel like to hear the voice of the Creator himself speaking directly to you? Not through a burning bush or a prophet's words, but thundering from heaven with commands meant to guide humanity for all time. The mountain trembled beneath their feet as they stood poised to receive something no people had ever received before. God's voice rolled across the camp like thunder, speaking the words that would form the foundation of their covenant relationship. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. This wasn't a distant deity imposing arbitrary rules, but the same God who had split the sea before them and provided bread from heaven. Their deliverer was now becoming their guide. As God continued speaking, fear gripped the people. Each divine word seemed to pierce through flesh and spirit. The commandments began with relationship at their core, worshiping God alone, avoiding idols that reduced the infinite to the tangible, honoring his name rather than using it carelessly, and setting aside the Sabbath as sacred time. These first 4 commandments created the vertical dimension of their covenant, connecting heaven and earth. The voice continued, now addressing how they should live with one another. Honor parents. Do not murder. Remain faithful in marriage. Respect others' property by not stealing. Speak truth instead of lies. And finally, be content with what you have rather than coveting what belongs to others. These 6 commandments established the horizontal dimension of community life, weaving a social fabric that could withstand the challenges ahead. Lightning flashed across the sky as the divine voice fell silent. The people stood trembling, overwhelmed by the experience of direct divine communication. They backed away from the mountain, turning to Moses with pleading eyes. You speak to us and we will listen, they begged. But do not let God speak to us directly, or we will die. The weight of divine holiness had proven too much for human frailty. Moses understood their fear, yet encouraged them. Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. With these words, he left them at a safe distance and entered the thick darkness where God was. There, beyond human sight, Moses received more detailed instructions. Civil laws, festival observances, and specifications for worship that would shape their daily lives. When Moses returned, he carefully recorded everything God had spoken. The next morning, he built an altar at the foot of the mountain, setting up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Young men offered bulls as peace offerings and burnt offerings to the Lord. Moses took half the blood and put it in basins, while the other half he sprinkled on the altar. Then came a moment of solemn covenant-making. Moses read the book of the covenant to the people, who responded with one voice, Everything the Lord has said we will do, and we will be obedient." Moses took the remaining blood and sprinkled it on the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." In an extraordinary scene that followed, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel ascended partway up the mountain. There they beheld a vision of God unlike any other. Under his feet was something like a pavement of sapphire, clear as the sky itself. They ate and drank in God's presence, sealing their covenant relationship with a sacred meal. The Lord then called Moses higher up the mountain to receive stone tablets inscribed by God's own finger. "Come up to me on the mountain and stay here," God commanded, "and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and commandments I have written for their instruction." Moses ascended into the cloud covering the mountain, where he would remain for 40 days and 40 nights. 40 days may not seem long to us, but imagine standing at the foot of a mountain, watching the last glimpse of your leader vanish into thick clouds, with no timeline for his return. What happens when the people who witnessed 10 plagues, walked through a parted sea, and heard God's voice from the mountain decide they've waited long enough? Their response reveals our own uncomfortable tendency to replace what we cannot see with what we can control. The waiting had stretched their patience to breaking. Day after day passed with no sign of Moses returning. The clouds still shrouded the mountain peak, but uncertainty began to spread through the camp like a shadow. Fear crept into their conversations. What if Moses has perished in the fire? Who will lead us now? Who will speak to God for us? The people gathered around Aaron, their anxiety turning to demand. "Come, make us gods who will go before us," they insisted. "As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Notice how quickly they referred to Moses as this Moses, distance already forming in their hearts from the man who had been God's instrument of their deliverance. Aaron, left in charge but lacking his brother's courage, surrendered to their pressure. Rather than standing firm, he instructed them to take off their gold earrings, jewelry they had received from the Egyptians as they departed. Imagine the irony. The very gold God provided for building his sanctuary was now being collected for an idol. Aaron's hands, which had once been raised alongside Moses during battle, now fashioned a golden calf with an engraving tool. When the gleaming idol stood before them, Aaron built an altar and proclaimed, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." He even announced a festival to the Lord for the following day, attempting perhaps to blend the worship of Yahweh with this visible representation. The celebration began at daybreak with burnt offerings and peace offerings. Then the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, a phrase suggesting not innocent recreation but wild, sensual revelry that mimicked pagan worship practices. Meanwhile, on the mountain, God spoke to Moses about the unfolding tragedy. "Go down," he commanded, "because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt." Notice how even God distanced himself from them, calling them your people rather than my people. His anger burned hot as he threatened to consume them and start anew with Moses. But Moses stood in the gap. He reminded God of his own reputation among the nations and the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Would the Egyptians say that God brought Israel out into the wilderness only to destroy them? Would his covenant promises be forgotten? Moses didn't defend Israel's actions but appealed to God's character and faithfulness. As Moses descended with the stone tablets in hand, the sounds of celebration reached his ears. Rounding the final bend, he witnessed the full scene, dancing bodies circling the golden image, the altar smoking with sacrifices, his own brother presiding over it all. Righteous anger surged through him. He threw down the tablets, shattering them at the mountain's base, a powerful visual representation of the covenant they had just broken. Moses took the calf, burned it in fire, ground it to powder, scattered it on water, and made the people drink it. When he confronted Aaron, his brother offered a shameful excuse. "You know how prone these people are to evil. They gave me the gold, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf, as if the idol had formed itself without his craftsmanship. Standing at the entrance to the camp, Moses called out, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." The sons of Levi gathered around him. At his command, they took up swords and moved throughout the camp, putting to death about 3,000 people who persisted in their rebellion. Blood stained the desert sand that day, but what happened next reveals a side of God that challenges our deepest assumptions about divine justice. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to ask the Creator of the universe to show you his true nature, especially after witnessing such terrible judgment? Moses did exactly that, and what God revealed about himself in that moment has shaped our understanding of divine mercy for thousands of years. In the somber aftermath of the golden calf incident, Moses climbed back up Mount Sinai. His heart was heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. The covenant tablets lay shattered at the mountain's base, a visible reminder of the broken relationship between God and his people. Yet Moses approached God not with excuses or fear, but with a bold request for restoration. "Please forgive their sin," Moses pleaded. "But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." What extraordinary courage this took to offer himself in place of the guilty. Moses was willing to sacrifice his own eternal standing to save the very people who had disappointed him so deeply. In this selfless intercession, we glimpse the heart of true leadership. God responded with both justice and mercy. He would indeed punish sin, but he would not abandon his people. Then Moses made an even bolder request that revealed his deepest longing. "Now show me your glory." Think about the audacity of this prayer. After everything that had happened, Moses wasn't asking for assurance of forgiveness or protection. He was asking to see the very essence of God himself. God's answer came as a gentle accommodation to human frailty. No one could see his face and live, but he would place Moses in the cleft of a rock, cover him with his hand as he passed by, and allow him to see his back. Can you picture it? Moses, hidden in the rock's protection, waiting with anticipation for this divine encounter. Then came the moment that would echo through human history, God passing before Moses, proclaiming his own name and nature. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. In these words, we hear the perfect balance of God's character, a love that forgives yet a holiness that cannot ignore sin. This self-revelation became the core understanding of God's nature for Israel and continues to shape our concept of divine mercy today. With reverence, Moses cut 2 new stone tablets and ascended the mountain again for another 40 days. There, the covenant was renewed. The terms remained unchanged, God's standards never lowered, but the relationship was restored through divine grace. When Moses descended this time, his face radiated with such brilliant light that he had to wear a veil when speaking to the people, for they could not bear to look at him. This physical transformation mirrored the spiritual reality. An ordinary human being had been changed by prolonged exposure to God's presence. The glory that Moses sought to see had now, in some measure, been imparted to him. The people who had fashioned a golden calf now witnessed the true reflection of divine glory in the face of their leader. The glory that transformed Moses' face was about to find a home in the center of Israel's camp. What happens when the God who created the cosmos designs his own dwelling place and invites imperfect human hands to build it? The story of the tabernacle reveals a stunning paradox. The infinite God purposely containing his presence in a finite space so he could journey with his people through the wilderness. After Moses descended the mountain with the renewed covenant, God unveiled his remarkable plan, a portable sanctuary where his presence would dwell among them. But unlike the golden calf fashioned in haste, this dwelling would follow divine blueprints down to the smallest detail. God described to Moses a sacred space of extraordinary beauty, with materials that would transform the ordinary desert into holy ground. The call went out through the camp for contributions, and what followed astonished everyone. The people who had once surrendered their jewelry for an idol now brought offerings of a different kind: blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, fine linen, goat hair, ram skins dyed red, acacia wood, olive oil, spices, and precious stones. Morning after morning, they came until the craftsman told Moses, "The people are bringing more than enough." For the first time in Israel's history, Moses had to restrain their generosity rather than motivate it. God appointed 2 master craftsmen to oversee this sacred work. Bezalel, whose name means "in the shadow of God," received wisdom, understanding, and skill in every kind of craftsmanship. Alongside him worked Oholiab, gifted with teaching others. These men received something unprecedented. Scripture tells us they were filled with the Spirit of God specifically for artistic creation. Their hands would translate divine vision into tangible reality. Picture the tabernacle taking shape in the center of Israel's encampment. The outer courtyard, enclosed by linen hangings supported by bronze pillars, created a sacred boundary. Within this courtyard stood the bronze altar where sacrifices would be offered and a bronze basin where priests would wash before service. Beyond this stood the tabernacle tent itself, covered with layers of fine linen, goat hair, and dyed skins. Inside, the sanctuary was divided into 2 spaces. The holy place contained the golden lampstand with its 7 branches burning with pure olive oil, the table of showbread with its 12 loaves, and the altar of incense where prayers would rise like fragrant smoke. Behind a thick, embroidered veil lay the most holy place, a perfect cube containing only the Ark of the Covenant. This gold-covered chest held the tablets of the covenant, with the mercy seat on top flanked by golden cherubim with outstretched wings. Each element carried profound symbolism. The bronze altar spoke of sacrifice and atonement. The lampstand represented God's light. The table with 12 loaves symbolized God's provision for all 12 tribes. The veil separated sinful humanity from perfect holiness. And at the center of it all, the ark represented God's throne on earth, where mercy would meet justice. As the final threads were sewn and the last pieces assembled, Moses inspected everything against the divine pattern he had received. The text repeats a powerful phrase, "Just as the Lord had commanded." Nothing was added by human innovation. Nothing was subtracted through neglect. When every piece was completed, Moses blessed the people who had transformed raw materials into sacred space through their obedience. The first day of the first month of the second year dawned with anticipation. 1 year had passed since the Israelites had left Egypt, and now the moment had arrived to assemble the dwelling place of God. Can you picture the hushed reverence as Moses directed the setting up of the tabernacle? The silver sockets were placed first, forming the foundation. Next came the gold-covered frames, standing tall and connected by crossbars. The colorful curtains followed, their blues, purples, and scarlets shimmering in the morning light. The entire camp watched as each precious item found its designated place within the sanctuary. Moses followed every instruction precisely, placing the Ark of the Covenant inside the most holy place and hanging the veil to separate it from the holy place. He arranged the table of showbread to the north and the golden lampstand to the south, their crafted beauty reflecting the early light. The altar of incense stood just before the veil, ready for its sacred purpose. With gentle reverence, Moses took the holy anointing oil and consecrated each element. Can you envision the glistening drops of fragrant oil being poured over the altar, the basin, and every vessel? The scent of spices filled the air: cinnamon, cassia, and myrrh, creating a cloud of sweetness that spread throughout the camp. This wasn't merely ceremonial. It was a setting apart, transforming ordinary materials into vessels of divine purpose. Aaron and his sons stood at the entrance of the tent of meeting as Moses washed them with water from the bronze basin. Layer by layer, he dressed them in their priestly garments, the white linen tunic, the colorful sash, the ephod with its shoulder pieces bearing the names of the tribes. The breastplate with 12 precious stones rested against Aaron's heart, representing the 12 tribes he would carry before the Lord. The turban with its golden plate declaring, "Holy to the Lord," crowned his head. As Moses poured the anointing oil on Aaron's head, it ran down his beard and onto the collar of his robe, symbolizing how God's blessing flows downward in abundance. Then it happened, something no human eye had witnessed since creation itself. The cloud of glory descended from heaven, enveloping the tent of meeting. What began as a wisp of divine presence grew until it completely covered the sanctuary. Inside, the tabernacle blazed with the kabod, the weighty, tangible glory of God. Light streamed from within, so brilliant that it penetrated through the layers of curtains and coverings. Moses, who had spoken with God face to face and survived the revelation of divine glory on the mountain, now found himself unable to enter. The presence was too overwhelming, too concentrated. The man who had mediated between God and Israel stood outside, humbled by the intensity of divine habitation. What must it have felt like to witness such a moment? The creator of stars and mountains choosing to dwell in a tent made by human hands? For the Israelites who had crafted each piece, what wonder must have filled their hearts? Their work of obedience had become the dwelling place of God. The same cloud that had guided them through the wilderness now rested upon their handiwork, sanctifying everything their hands had fashioned. This cloud became their divine compass for the journey ahead. When it lifted from the tabernacle, they would dismantle their camp and follow where it led. When it remained, they would stay put, whether for days, weeks, or months. Their rhythm of life became synchronized with God's movements. At night, the cloud transformed into a pillar of fire, providing both guidance and protection in the darkness. That rhythm of divine guidance wasn't merely a spiritual concept. It transformed the entire fabric of daily life for the Israelites. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to visibly see God's direction for every decision, every move, every journey? Imagine awakening each morning and looking toward the tabernacle, watching for the slightest shift in the cloud that would signal your next step. This nomadic existence required an entirely new mindset. The Israelites had to develop a readiness to move at a moment's notice, regardless of how comfortable they might have become in a particular location. Families learned to pack efficiently, keeping essentials accessible. What once would have seemed chaotic became their new pattern of life. Tents collapsed and bundled, belongings secured, livestock gathered, all while maintaining their tribal formations. Children grew up with this divine guidance as their only normal. Unlike their parents who remembered the rigid schedules of Egyptian slavery, these little ones knew only the freedom of following God's presence. They would ask innocently, "How long will we stay here, Father?" Only to receive the same answer each time, "Until the cloud moves." Consider how this transformed their understanding of time itself. In Egypt, their days had been measured by the rising and setting of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, and the merciless demands of taskmasters. Now, time flowed according to God's purposes alone. A single location might host them for days, weeks, or even months before the cloud would lift and signal their departure. The wilderness became their classroom, teaching lessons impossible to learn in Egypt or even in the Promised Land. Mothers nursing newborns learned to trust God's timing, knowing He would not move them before they were ready for the journey. Elders passed down stories around evening fires, recounting the miracles they had witnessed with their own eyes. Young men and women formed new families beneath the watchful presence of the cloud, their wedding celebrations illuminated by the pillar of fire. Through this divine choreography, God was shaping them into something more than just freed slaves. He was forming a people with a distinct identity and purpose. The synchronized movement of an entire nation following God's presence strengthened community bonds in ways no human leader could have engineered. Disputes between families were resolved quickly, as no one knew when the cloud might lift and require immediate cooperation. Even in their uncertainty, there was profound security. No enemy could approach their camp at night without being exposed by the light of the fire. No harsh desert sun could overwhelm them by day with the cloud providing shade. Their divine compass never led them into terrain too difficult to traverse or situations beyond their capacity to endure. Moses himself faced moments of doubt throughout this journey. The weight of leadership pressed heavily as he mediated disputes, communicated God's instructions, and bore the complaints of a people still learning to trust. Yet in those moments, God responded not with rebuke but with reassurance, sometimes through the visible reminder of his presence in the cloud, other times through private encounters at the tent of meeting where Moses would speak with God face to face, as a man speaks with his friend. Those private encounters between Moses and God reveal something profound about wilderness seasons in our lives. What appears empty and desolate to our eyes often becomes the very ground where heaven touches earth most directly. The Israelites didn't just wander aimlessly through desert terrain. They were being transformed by it, learning lessons impossible to grasp while comfortable in Egypt or settled in the Promised Land. Consider how the wilderness stripped away every false security. No longer could they rely on Egyptian systems or their own strength. Each morning's hunger reminded them of dependence. Every thirst became a lesson in trust. The very landscape that seemed to offer nothing became the canvas where God painted his most vivid revelations of himself. In those barren places, their relationship with God became intensely personal. No longer was he simply a deity their ancestors had worshipped. He became their daily bread, their water, their shade, their guide. The wilderness transformed abstract faith into lived experience. What began as a journey of mere physical liberation evolved into spiritual transformation. Perhaps you've experienced your own wilderness seasons, times when familiar comforts were stripped away, when the path forward seemed unclear. Those periods of disorientation, while painful, often become the most significant chapters in our spiritual formation. Like sand in an oyster that eventually produces a pearl, wilderness irritations can produce unexpected beauty. Notice how the wilderness revealed God's character progressively. With each challenge, another facet of his nature came into view. At the bitter waters of Marah, they discovered him as healer. In the provision of manna, they knew him as provider. Through victory over the Amalekites, they experienced him as banner. At Sinai, they encountered him as lawgiver. The wilderness became a living classroom where theory became reality. The wilderness also defined Israel's identity. They entered as a scattered collection of slaves but were formed into a covenant community. Their shared experiences of hardship and divine intervention created bonds stronger than blood relation. The wilderness didn't just change where they lived, it transformed who they were. This pattern of redemption teaches us something vital. God delivers not just from something but to something greater. Freedom from Egypt wasn't the final goal. It was the beginning of relationship. The constraints of the wilderness actually created space for intimacy that prosperity might have prevented. Sometimes what feels like restriction is actually protection, directing us toward deeper purpose. The rhythm of cloud and fire offers perhaps the most beautiful lesson. God's guidance wasn't a one-time direction but a continuous presence. Some days brought movement, others stillness, but all unfolded under divine watchfulness. The wilderness taught them to move at God's pace, not racing ahead in self-reliance nor lagging behind in fear. Your own wilderness may look different. Perhaps it's a season of loss, uncertainty, or waiting. But the same God who guided Israel guides you. Your barren places may feel purposeless, but they are precisely where God does his deepest work. The wilderness isn't a detour from God's plan. It's often the very path he uses to prepare you for promises yet unfulfilled. As you drift towards sleep tonight, remember that the journey of Exodus isn't just an ancient tale, but a timeless picture of God's unwavering faithfulness. The same God who illuminated the darkness with fire and sheltered his people from the scorching sun continues to guide your steps today. His presence remains just as real, just as close. Perhaps tonight you're standing before your own impossible sea, with no way forward and threats pressing in from behind. Or maybe you simply need the assurance of daily provision for ordinary needs. Take comfort in knowing that the God who divided waters and sweetened bitter springs still works wonders in the lives of his children. Your wilderness season isn't meaningless wandering. It's sacred ground where dependence deepens and faith is forged. The barren places in your life aren't detours but divinely appointed pathways. As you close your eyes tonight, trust that even when the way seems uncertain, you never walk alone. The wilderness has always been God's classroom of intimacy, where he reveals himself most clearly to those who seek him. Please like this video if you enjoyed it and consider subscribing to our channel to join our community and for more videos like this. Now I wish you a peaceful and blessed sleep, and I'll see you on the next video. May God bless you.